creativity and innovation. Yet how ill-equipped cultural ministries and departments still are to address this kind of vision effectively. And one is struck by the way in which the research and analysis that has been generated, either directly or indirectly, by official agencies has been largely descriptive and driven primarily by predetermined political criteria. The culture of many cultural policy researchers, indeed, is particularly those who operate as consultants for one public authority or another, is a mostly unproblematized object. It's analysis that's pretty functionalist. The research questions rarely range beyond the delivery or non-delivery of a set of outputs, but the premises on which these outputs are defined, the values they embody, or the sometimes covert goals they pursue, in other words, the outcomes, are rarely addressed. And this can be a problem, it seems to me, with respect to that notion of solutioneering, that was Malcolm Long, or pragmatic body of information that Richard Eccles called for this morning. Another issue, one that isn't often raised, however, is that the cultural state of things, or what you might call the cultural system in many parts of the world, is largely determined by forces that are quite beyond the ken or control of official policy, whether or not that official policy is informed by research. You take the example of my country of origin, India. The contemporary cultural system is very much dominated by the output and works of Bollywood, and that popular culture which is generated around Bollywood and other Indian centers of film and television production. The policies, the official policies of the government, whether it's in information or in culture, impinge very superficially or not at all on this particular universe. What the cultural policy of India actually does is pretty much awards, prizes, and that sort of thing in high culture. And even the official attempts at cultural diplomacy, projecting an image of India abroad, pale into total insignificance when compared to what the impact and reach of Bollywood actually are. And in India, as in many other multi-ethnic nations, you also have the problem that cultural policy thinking at governmental level is inscribed in terms that are so narrow that they miss the way in which the discourses of nationalism, development, modernization, or even citizenship mobilize different forms of cultural expression, and the ways in which the hierarchies that are built into these discourses trump all sorts of notions. It could be of authenticity or tradition or whatever. And there are also the contexts in which cultural systems exist. And by this I mean the economic and socio-political environments in which policies are articulated and enacted, as well as the histories within which they have developed. In much of Africa or Asia, for example, the institutionalized cultural sector is small and of recent origin. Little cultural life actually takes place in venues such as theaters and museums. Such institutions exist, to be sure, both as colonial legacies and as recently developed instruments for the deployment of discourses of cultural modernity and nation building. Yet in reality, the societies concerned have not yet experienced the kinds of transformations that have made culture a recognized domain of public intervention. There are yet other ways in which cultural policy as it is currently envisioned doesn't really do justice to the breadth that ways of life definition actually sets out. And that breadth is one of the sort of examples I could give is the last version, the most recent version of a book series that I co-edit is devoted to the theme, to the triad of terms heritage, memory, in the sense of public or collective memory and identity. And many of the very fraught issues of power, of inclusion, exclusion, domination, oppression that come up around issues of heritage, memory, identity, remembering and forgetting, and who has the right to be remembered or publicly recognized and remembered. These are all very fundamental cultural policy issues, but they don't really form part of the remit. And that aspect of things has increasingly gone over to the camp, the cultural policy camp, which is the academically driven critical cultural policy discourse camp. That is, people who think of cultural policy as the clash of ideas, of institutional struggles and power relations in the production and circulation of symbolic meanings. And I'm obviously referring here to much of the work in cultural studies, work that's influenced by anthropology and other related disciplines. And many of you in this room are probably too young to even know about this, but in the early 90s there was a big debate in Australia, which was very ideological. And the big debate, I think Stewart was involved, but certainly Tony Bennett, Tom O'Regan and others, was between this notion of how critical analysis on the one hand and instrumental government servicing purposes on the other. And although the debate may seem completely kind of superseded old hat today in the light of the neoliberal settlement, it seems to me that it has left enduring traces, and that there is still quite a big divide between those two camps. And there was a triple wager that was set out by Tony Bennett soon after this debate that took place, and he termed this triple wager in the following three sort of ideas. First, and I'm paraphrasing, to configure policy stances and actions that are appropriate to the relations between contemporary societies, governments, but not just governments, and the plural meanings of culture they deploy. Second, to explore complex forms of cultural management and administration in ways that deliver adequate historical understanding and theoretical purchase. And thirdly, to forge effective and productive relationships with intellectual workers in policy bureau and agencies, that's very much Tony Bennett's terms, and cultural institutions, but as well as, rather than at the expense of, other connections, and indeed often as a means of pursuing issues arising from those other connections. And so what you have is this kind of divide with two sets of people on either side of it. I dare say that the work that's being carried out by the CCI and this constellation of efforts of this sort is the kind of work that would probably fit this kind of midpoint that I'm trying to get at, that is missed so much in many parts of the world, between critical analysis and advocacy, or governmentally driven agendas. And what I was going to, actually I think if I look at my watch and the time I started, I should have 3 minutes. So will you give me 3 in instead of 1? The issue that I really find that I observe in many parts of the world is that when you look at the problems in that way, the cultural arms of government are not really well equipped to engage effectively with market-driven, and even more than that, with digital culture. Official bodies have neither the mandate nor the expertise to grasp the complexities of a market-driven sector whose outputs don't conform to canons of valuation and valorization that are applied to subsidized culture. It's very difficult for governments to think cross-sectorally between different governmental mandates and sectors of society, and Eccles was referring to that this morning. It is generally just as, if not much more difficult, for them to overcome the inherent short-termism of the political system as a whole, and to address strategic longer-term questions and engage in some type of anticipatory planning of future policy in the sorts of terms that Terry Cutler was enjoining upon us this morning, and particularly in the ways in which not just cultural production and consumption, but also much wider socio-cultural conditions are going to evolve. And it's also very difficult for them, despite the rhetoric, to actually work out really broadly based platforms for public participation. That is much more democratic forms of decision-making. And so this is where I can close, because these remarks that I prepared before coming here and before listening to you over the last 2 days were going to be, I was going to conclude on the notion that cultural policy is something where we have expectations that are a little too great, that there are illusions, that there are a lot of illusions, and we need to be a little bit more realistic about those illusions. But having listened to you over the last 2 days, I think what I will adopt as my last words is that maybe I was completely wrong, and to paraphrase or to quote Mark Twain, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. That was a fabulous analysis of cultural policy, particularly as we're facing a convergence review right now. Next, I'd like to introduce Lydia Green, who really needs no introduction here at CCI. She's been here from the start, professor at ECU, and she's talking to us about a project